First of all, thank you so much to Danielle for organizing this event. It's been remarkable, so many wonderful conversations over the last day, and I'm just really honored to be a part of this among so many amazing people who have long been, my teachers, my inspiration, people that I've followed for a really long time. So it's really exciting for me to be here. This title is like way more lofty and definitive than I think it probably should be. This is really just sort of a collection of some work and some speculations that try to think about this issue of architectural automation. As Felicia mentioned, I am both sort of an artist and, as of recently, a senior researcher at WeWork. On the WeWork side, I'm part of a team that works to use data, spatial analytics, and environmental psychology to sort of inform our design teams, to help the business grow, and to create better places to work for our members. And then on the artist side, and I've never known whether to sort of think of this as art as more of like a speculative architectural drawing process, I'm sort of using algorithms and computation to produce various like visual abstractions and explore issues like automation. Specifically, I've been really interested in this idea of automating architecture for a very long time, creating algorithms that can produce sort of architectural ideas or architectural artifacts, if not architecture full stop. And this is definitely not a new idea. This is a book that was in the library at the WeWork sort of research area from 1977, and it already documents a lot of prior experiments in automation, even if I think in retrospect, a lot of those experiments and a lot of the hope of this sort of promise of architectural automation really just amounted to sort of a series of failures or, kind of roads that didn't end up getting taken. And for me, and I think this resonates with what Madeline was saying, I think digital processes, sort of all digital processes, really lie between these two poles. I don't think there's any digital process that is fully automated. Someone somewhere provided it with some inputs or authored it with certain constraints. Even the most sophisticated unguided machine learning model has been sort of set up in a particular way. And even more mundane tools that maybe we don't think of as really related to automation, like BIM, tools like Revit, actually sit in the middle of this continuum. They're about, say, automating the process of making drawings. But nonetheless, there's a lot of hand-wringing about this problem, this sort of risk or fear that robots are going to take our jobs, are going to make humans obsolete, and the sort of vaguely reassuring statistic that I think gets tossed around quite a lot from University of Oxford researchers Carl Frey and Michael Osborne is that architects only have a 1.8% chance of being fully automated in the next 20 years. So we're all safe. We can all take a deep breath. I hear architects confronted with this prospect of automation sort of retreat to a line that an automaton will never cross. So maybe that's not straight lines. I think we've kind of crossed that line already. But maybe it's the ability to negotiate and handle complex personal interactions with clients. Or more often, it's something about the ineffable, about beauty, about nuance and composition. And that's actually one of the things that I want to challenge. In general, I think it's actually hard to draw a line about what will or won't be automatable. It's very hard to know what things are or are not amenable to sort of computational processes. And I will say, I do agree that architecture will not be fully automated anytime soon. I think it's this sort of common understanding of what is and isn't possible is often mistaken or misplaced. So a lot of my drawing practice tries to get at this. So I'm looking at, in this example, sort of 2D composition. This is a drawing that resulted from a kind of generative algorithm that I created. And, I don't know about you, I find this composition kind of pleasing, and I really had, I had some authorship in the creation of the algorithm that generated it, but I didn't draw a single line or really think about the content of the composition at all. And one of the consequences of automation is that it's sort of infinitely repeatable. So these are also outcomes from that same set of algorithmic instructions, and so are these. So there's this potential to produce a kind of computational novelty. It's very easy to get a computer to generate many variations on a similar idea. But one of the things that I find is that there's kind of a limit to that novelty, at least in my own experiments. After about 2,000 iterations, I start to kind of lose interest in what is being automated. It like fails to be novel or pleasing anymore. And so, I don't think that this is necessarily computational creativity per se, but I think it can be a valuable scaffold for creativity or an aid to a human operating in a design process. So, this doesn't have to be limited to two-dimensional work either. So I've been really interested as well in the issue of architectural style, kind of identifiable stylistic moves in sort of 3D space. These are a series of houses done in the Sea Ranch style by Joseph Escherich and others in California. And at one point, I set out to create an algorithm that could, maybe create something that looked like it had been designed in the Sea Ranch style. So I'm often striving for scripts that, at least when you squint, can pass like a sort of architectural Turing test or look like they could have been conceived by a human. So just a few more examples. Inevitably, some of these look quite convincing and some of them look absolutely ridiculous. I also like, in this particular graphic, all of the gaps, which is where the algorithm fails entirely to produce anything. No result at all, let alone like a good one. And this is a little obsession that has kind of dogged me for a while, whether it's Sea Ranch houses or Eames houses or Neutra houses. These are things that I was sort of pursuing in some of the early research for my undergraduate thesis, which focused on kind of automating some aspects of the case study house program. And Donna, who was my professor at the time, told me it was a little nostalgic. And so I maybe shifted gears a little bit. But the project that I want to kind of focus on, the sort of primary image or set of images that I've sort of selected to talk about today, looks at a little beyond just the production of an image that maybe could pass for architecture, and looking at the tools that we as a discipline depend on. So this is about a composition called the 8 House, or 1.8%, of which one piece is in the Miller Gallery. And it's a project that used all of the above tools. These are kind of the industry standard tools for doing building information modeling or computational modeling or 3D modeling of any kind. And I wanted to just start with the question of like, how far can the tools that we currently use as an architectural discipline take us in the direction of sort of fully automating architecture? So I take, for this project as my point of departure, probably the most mundane, anodyne piece of design imaginable, which is the Autodesk Revit sample project, which ships with the software. This is like, if you've ever been to like an Autodesk tutorial or training conference or whatever, you've seen this house and you've used it to do something. For me, it sort of serves to represent this baseline expectation of architectural design and documentation that's sort of held in the mind of the software. It's like, this is what Revit thinks the sort of baseline of architecture is. So I set out to use the tools seen before to automatically generate effectively infinite variations on this Revit sample project. Which meant, in addition to, so instead of just creating, a box or a shape that looked like a house, this house has rooms, has walls, has windows, has doors. Notably, it doesn't have ceilings and it doesn't have stairs because those are outside of the scope of what the Revit API allows you to automate. And that was one of the major points of this project, was to try to understand what are the limits of the software? What are the things that, even the industry standard software doesn't really make accessible to a sort of automated process? There's also a lot of manual button pushing required for every one of these, so it didn't really fit the definition of full automation, in that I couldn't just sit back and go get a coffee and wait for it to finish generating 300 houses. So I only got as far as 11. But I wanted to, in addition to this sort of pseudo-practical look at automation, I wanted to also try to connect it back to this practice of sort of graphic abstraction and a more sort of speculative thought about architectural drawing. So the second half of the project digests all of the 2D line work, the plans, the elevations, the axons, et cetera, that are output from Revit as the kind of automatically generated sections and drawings, and recompose them algorithmically into a single composition by composing them or treating them as only lines and sequentially adding them to a new drawing. And this is a place I do want to challenge Carl's definition of drawing from yesterday. For me, the critical component of drawing is not necessarily like whether it's finite or can be edited or whether it exists in a physical medium, but whether it has a capacity for ambiguity and invites sort of a feedback loop of human interpretation. So this is one of the sort of final components of that drawing. This is the composite axon of all 11 houses. This is the composite plan, and this is the drawing that's hanging in the Miller Gallery. And I don't want to make the claim that this is like the only answer to kind of how you combat the sort of relentless practicality of certain kinds of automation, but it is a way to let automation be weird, to let it kind of productively contribute to a conceptual or creative process, or you're kind of estranging or rethinking architectural representation itself. And I like to see this as maybe in the kind of lineage or vein of like Libeskind's Micromegas and the kind of rethinking of conventions of architectural representation. I love the way the like grid bubbles are cut and treated in the same way as any other piece of line work in this drawing. So to return to this diagram and make a few kind of speculations, I think that as the industry moves forward, we'll see the possibilities kind of asymptotically approach full automation. It will be possible to create a sort of fully automated architectural result, or at least quite close to it. And that asymptote implies also a lot of diminishing returns. But I think maybe more importantly, we'll see the threshold of kind of practicality down at the bottom move further and further into this semi-automated or augmented territory. And when I say that practical threshold, what I mean is the threshold below which it will be impractical to operate any other way. So I think we're kind of here now. There's a lot that's possible in this kind of augmented space. We're far from full automation, but I think both sides of this line are going to sort of accelerate upwards into more augmented, more automated territory. And I want to close with just a few examples of potential trajectories that some of this might take on the basis of some projects of mine and others. So I think this kind of practical automation will show up first in the sort of tools that we use. This is a desk layout tool that my colleagues Carlo Bailey and Carl Anderson at WeWork have been developing, and I've sort of just joined onto this project. This is an extremely narrow and specific kind of task, the problem of laying out desks in an office of arbitrary shape, which even something that's so simple that a designer could do it mindlessly, poses a pretty challenging computational problem. The Python API that performs these layouts is about 3,000 lines of code, just to give you a sense. But I'm really interested in this kind of distillation of architectural knowledge or sort of disciplinary expertise into a series of code tools or algorithms that sort of represent a way of thinking about these problems. There's another example I like to give. This is John Gould's Renee permutational design tool, which is for web design, where essentially a designer is interactively moving through many different options and picking, a couple fonts and a couple sizes and a couple colors, and it sort of does a combinatorial explosion of all of the possibilities across these, multiple variants, but then a user can kind of pick one and then use that as the starting point for the next series of exploration. So I think sort of automatically studying possibilities, but then returning and refining is sort of the shape that a lot of these interactive automated design tools will take. I think automation also opens the door to stranger kinds of models for design, and particularly interactions with a public. So this is a project I did back in 2012 to automate formal self-diagrammed design studies through tweets. So a user tweets at this Twitter bot a series of formal operations which sort of diagram themselves and produce one of these sort of sequences of operations that are used to justify rational design decisions, where it's like, oh yeah, I just twisted it and slid it and split it, and that's why the form is the way it is. I don't, this is just, one instance, but I think this model of using automation as a mechanism to expose some of the problems of design or some of the interactions with design to a greater public is also really promising. So, just to wrap up, these are all sort of generative experiments in 2D and 3D, and for me, I've never quite known what to do with these other than think of them as sort of a wealth of permutations and combinations automatically generated that demand that we hone as designers our curatorial and selective skills above our sort of like tabula rasa, sit down and start sketching on a piece of paper. I think there's going to be a lot of value in the ability to select and refine and iterate with a computer as a partner. And whatever the nature of this automation turns out to be, I hold on to the hope that the architectural profession can take a little bit of ownership over the process and have some agency in the creation of these algorithms themselves. I think we should be the considered and careful authors of the automation of our profession, because if we don't, other industries are ready to jump on that. So it's also, I think, an interesting test if we really believe the things we tell ourselves about the value of architecture as a discipline, whether that's the delight, completing the Vitruvian trifecta. The challenge of automation is going to force us to articulate the value of architecture itself, the value that human architects bring to the world above and beyond practical problem solving, which computers are like good at in some senses, and stylistic prowess, which I think computers can also have a toehold in. So yeah, that's it.